Everyone good? Actually, this is better. Okay. I affirm resolve. The United States ought to ban the use of eminent domain for economic development takings. I value morality as all indicates a moral obligation. The rule of law is distinct from a rule of law, Waldron 16. A rule of law is used to designate some particular legal rule. The rule of law is used when ideas of our political morality and refers to the ascendancy of law in the institutions. The rule of law comprises the principles of formal and procedural character, addressing the way in which community is governed. The formal principles concern norms, and procedural principles concern the processes by which norms are administered. Maintain the rule of law is necessary to prevent arbitrary state action, unfair power structures, and coercive violence. Gowder 13 writes, regularity defines the lines between states that control official violence and those in which police use violence willy-nilly. This is the most fundamental function of the rule of law. Regularity requires the state coercive power be exercised impersonally and protects individuals from subjected to official terror. Unless official coercion is rule-bound, officials will be able to use their power to revenge themselves against their enemies, to expropriate property, and to extort deferential treatment. The rule of law is especially vital in the function of democracy. Allen and Chenoweth, 09, write, the use of arbitrary power and anathema to the rule of law. Constitution limits the power requires the subjugation of authority to the country's laws established through consent of adopted representatives. The rule of law is the supreme check and power against the people. The rule of law must prevent the minority from arbitrary power and tyranny of the majority. And undermine the rule of law demonstrates the importance of maintaining the rule of law. Allen and Chenoweth, 2, writes, a government that is not bound by laws is lawless. Without equality before the law, the rule of law is meaning only for a few. Contradictions in principle or practice do not negate the rule of law's essential importance. In democratic society, deviations from the principles of the rule of law, such as systematic discrimination, serve as powerful arguments in favor of the fulfillment of those principles rather than invalidating it. Thus, my value criterion is maintaining the rule of law. Contention 1 is undercompensation. Economic development takings are detrimental to the rule of law by enabling undercompensation. Economic development takings are likely to result in undercompensation because they can't guarantee the reciprocity advantage that comes with eminent domain used for truly public purposes. Also, many purported benefits of economic development takings never come to fruition. Cohen 06 writes, undercompensation is justified by reference to reciprocity advantage. Concerns about undercompensation are at the lowest when the proposed public use is public in the broadest sense. Among states that permit takings for economic development, none impose any requirement for condemning authority or transfer or provide any binding assurance for benefits actually will occur. The absence of any requirement encourages overstated projections, even when backers are acting in good faith. The possibility that there's no benefit to the public or less benefits always present in the poll talking. The actual benefits provided by GM fell short of 6,150 jobs projected. Detroit may have sustained a net job loss as a result of projected argument that undercompensated condemnees benefit from reciprocity advantages is particularly weak in economic development takings. Just compensation is essential to properly limit the state's power in taking property. Cohen 2 writes, just compensation prevents the government from overusing taking power. Compensation is set to be an essential check on power, forcing local officials to internalize the cost of taking. Just compensation also thought to encourage efficiency by forcing officials to recognize whether the proposed project will produce more value than the amount of compensation that must be paid. Undercompensation allows the government to avoid internalizing the full cost, operating with fiscal illusion that the property is worth less than it is, leading to inefficiencies. If compensation is offered only at market value, the government does not have the appropriate incentive to avoid or taking properties are highly valued for unique reasons. Contention 2 is overextension of power. Eminent domain for economic development takings harms the rule of law by overextending the taking power of the government. Cohen 3 writes, the only way to mitigate concerns is by banning economic development takings to avoid loopholes and prohibitions against less harmful uses of eminent domain. The supposed public benefits of economic development against project can be public use, and there is no limit to the potential reach of eminent domain power. Nearly any use of private property can be said to generate some incidental benefit to the public. And contention 3 is unfairness and inequality. Economic development takings undermine the rule of law by failing to ensure fair and equal protection under law. Cohen 4 writes, interest group capture is a concern for the economic takings. The risk of that is abused for the political process by a powerful majority exerts control of the government that such a co-opted eminent domain power to confiscate the property of a less powerful minority. A politically powerful minority can capture the government process using these processes which own enrichment and private transfers to transfer the concern. In cases of the heel, there are further danger that powerful interests are enriching themselves or burdening the powerless minority. Many African American communities are destroyed, and because of housing discrimination, their former residents were shunted into other black neighborhoods, became overcrowded and expensive. Many of those beneficiaries, urban renewal, ended up paying higher prices for housing. These urban renewal programs consistently fell short of their goals of job creation and investment. The primary victims were the poor and politically powerless. Contention 4 is special interests. Eminent domain for economic development taking subversive rule of law in the interest of the privileged few. Cohen 5 writes, the decision to take property may be motivated by special interest desire to capture the surplus for personal profit, and government entities desire to place it their special interests. Concerns about a breakdown in the democratic process are among the most potent criticisms of development takings. That because the extremely deferential standard of review for public use determinations, public uses now with the legislature states legislators can sell the eminent domain power to special interests, promising durability, given the low probability that the judiciary will invalidate it. Economic development takings, especially vulnerable, because the economic development can justify almost any condemnation.
For those in the back, were you all able to hear, or did she need to speak louder? Okay.
So are we all good for cross-ex? Okay, I'm gonna ask the first cross-ex question. Let's start on the framework. What becomes the bright line, or I guess the tipping point to determining what is a good rule of law?
I would say the last Allen and Chenoweth card would contextualize that. The rule of law is something that exists as a concept or an ideal that exists within American society. So certain things like equality or checks and balances or making sure relationships between the government and the citizens are
So
contractual.
if the government had the objective of trying to provide affordable housing to people, but also to build up communities, why is that a bad sense of the rule of law?
First, I think you need to prove that that argument is related to eminent domain. Second,
It's not hard to prove that.
You still have to do it. Second,
Okay.
I think that even if you say that the government has an obligation to have things like housing, the framework obviously doesn't disagree that housing or things like the economy are necessarily good things.
No, but that's not my question. My question
I'm
is,
answering the question.
how exactly do you determine between two of those points? If your rule of law is saying things like private property matters, and my rule of law says that we need affordable housing to protect people from toxic environments, how exactly do we weigh between those two?
Well, first that assumes that there is a different conception of the rule of law. The rule of law is something that is distinct from like conceptions of having ideal government, but rather even if my argument here is not that if there are trade-offs between them, we do things that do not violate the rule of law, e.g. if eminent domain is something that violates the rule of law, we find a different policy to resolve things like housing and the economy. Those are obviously
okay,
good
let's talk about that in the context of undercompensation.
Sure.
You say it's about finding a different policy. How exactly will the government be able to meet everyone's measures of subjective value on their house, especially if someone has an arbitrary inflation on their house when their house only costs $100,000 and they want to charge $200,000?
Sure. So the first contention does not talk about subjective value. In fact, it talks about
things like just compensation,
undercompensation or irreciprocal compensation in the instance of like the expected outcome of the project itself. For example, the amount of benefit that the project itself.
No, but
might
let's talk
obtain.
about your second piece of Cohen evidence. And the card that you, or the part that you highlighted, it says if compensation is offered only at market value, the government does not have the appropriate incentive to avoid or taking properties that are highly valued for unique reasons. Some people might uniquely inflate their house to be $200,000. Why should the government have to meet that means, especially if that plot of land can be used to be built to build like affordable housing?
So let's think of an example, right? So let's say about a house at market value is $100,000, and somebody and they value the house at $200,000. Then you would have to weigh the amount that the government is willing to spend to buy that house. For example, they were like another project would take like $300,000, and maybe it's more cost effective for them to take the $200,000 anyway. Right, so in this instance, you just weigh the value between buying the house and not buying the house.
Let's talk about the third contention. You say that it leads to things like unfairness and inequality. Why is building housing or building malls for public uses itself leading to things like inequality?
So one, even if they're for public uses, they're forcing people out of communities to build those houses. So the people that they're most likely, the people that most need these kind of properties, these public uses, do not get benefited.
Okay.
Alrighty, so we'll start with a brief checkup on the content of the affirmative case for those of you who are unable to hear everything. So let's start easy. What was the value? Oh, I didn't expect everyone to answer at once. This is first. Okay, what was the first piece of evidence, the author name and the general idea of it? Does anyone want to answer? Anyone want to raise their hand and answer? Because otherwise there's going to be a weird murmur. Yes?
Out of 13, like governments that use violence willy-nilly don't have to law and rule laws.
Okay, so that is the second piece of evidence in the criterion, and you're correct, that is functionally the argument here, but what's the first one that was mentioned?
Was it Walton 16, which was like, rule of law is like necessary for government to regulate?
Yeah, so it was the Waldron 16 evidence, and it was tagged as the rule of law, distinct from a rule of law. What that means, I don't know, you'll have to ask Nick Smith, who I think got that piece of evidence. The third piece of evidence in the contention, can anyone tell me what the tagline and the author name is? Or not the contention, the criterion? Anyone? Yeah.
Allen and
Chenoweth, yes. And what was this? What was the argument they forwarded?
I didn't hear all of it, but it has
Yeah, it's vital to a democracy. And then there was one last piece of evidence, and what was that in the criterion?
I wouldn't show it to. It was
Yeah.
basically like inequality, violence, rule of law.
Sure, yeah, so it's like deviation from the rule of law results in things like discrimination and inequality. Okay, and then finally, what was the criterion text? This one should be easy. Maintaining the rule of law. So in cross-examination, there was a question posed about what is the rule of law. Can anyone tell me a little bit more about what the argument that was being sort of made in cross-examination was by the negative?
The rule of law is sort of subjective, like both sides of the case based on the rule of law. So the negative asking what exactly is the rule of law in the context of this debate, and the abstract that it's subjective.
Sure, does everyone agree that that is sort of what happened? Okay. How do you all feel about this? Was this a good push in cross-examination? Something that was worth attacking, something that was worth clarifying? Darius Johnson said yes, why?
Oh, because it just reframes the debate and yeah, the negative makes a sort of argument about one question, the sort of objective nature about the rule of law, which is something that's going to be very important in this debate. But also, furthermore, it kind of is already like I guess implicitly and explicitly making sort of arguments or setting up arguments for reasons why eminent domain is good. Also, even targets the very notion of like just compensation about. Sometimes it is typically seen for the United States to not give quote unquote just money to people. She targets back and is like, no, sometimes people make arbitrary claims at their house and it's not even worth that much. So yeah.
Alright, good debate to be had here. So how many contentions were there? There were a lot. 4, yeah. And there's one author for all the contentions, and that was Cohen. Okay, so let's talk about this first contention. What was it, tagline, or what was it called? Undercompensation. So can anyone briefly explain what undercompensation is?
So basically, the app is saying that in eminent domain you're supposed to be compensated for your property, and people are being undercompensated by the state.
Yeah, and so there was an example provided in the piece of evidence that you may or may not have caught. Can anyone tell me what that example was?
I think it's something about Detroit.
Yeah, and one particular company there, GM, and what happened with GM?
I believe they promised 6,000 jobs, or they didn't reach the jobs that they promised.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, if the negative is like eminent domain is really key to building the economy, how does this argument interact with that argument? So obviously one of the more common negative arguments is we got to help the economy. Yeah, so it's an excellent argument that is relatively well poised to tackle the most common negative argument on the topic that's related to the economy. All right, let's talk about the second contention. It's about overextension of power. Can anyone explain this argument back to me?
The government is basically choosing whenever they want to get power, and they're basically like somebody who belongs to another person, whether they like it or not, and that is like overusing their power.
Yeah, and that's because they can do what? Like they can just
do it because they have more power than the citizens, and nobody can do anything to stop them.
Yeah, correct. Because they can just say that everything is somewhat related to an economic development. It will somewhat boost the economy. It has some relatively minor tie, and it says in the card, nearly any use of private property can be said to generate some incidental benefit to the public. All right, contention 3 is about unfairness and inequality. Who wants to explain this argument back to me? I promise we're almost done with this.
So basically the way eminent domain is used is that it goes after like powerless, minority, or impoverished populations because they have the least leverage in the courts to actually hold onto their houses, so they get kind of like pushed out of neighborhoods for other people to move in.
Yeah, and then finally, contention 4 was about special interests. And can anyone explain this after? Someone from this side of the room, like not calling you all. I know there's a top ladder sitting over here, which means you all should be flowing the most in depth, so I'm interested to hear y'all's opinions. Sure, even though you're not.
Like, isn't it like sort of discrimination against like different people with backgrounds?
That's more closely related to the contention 3. Let's focus more on this sort of special interest, if I understand. The one, yeah, there, yellow shirt.
It's not being used for public good, it's being used for like private things, going against like the structure of like.
Can you say that louder for me? Sorry.
It's not going to like public use and the public good, it's helping like private, people, private corporations, and it's like, it's clashing with like the ideals of our democracy.
Okay, cool. So with that in mind, let's hear the negative case.
So it's just going to be an NC, and then I'm going to go into the affirmatives case. Are we all good?
Give me a second. Yeah.
1 second. Well, that was fast. Okay. Okay. Slow down just a little bit, but other than that, we're good to go.
Okay, are we all good? I negate the following. Resolve. The United States ought to ban the use of eminent domain for economic development takings. I value morality due to the use of term ought in the resolution. Revisionary intuitionism is true and proves util. That's Udovotsky 8. Meta-level moral reasoning had been worse than useless. People do much better when discussing whether torture is bad than when they discuss the meaning of good and bad. Thus, I deem it prudent to keep moral discussions at the object level. I see morality as a project of renormalizing intuition. Delete all intuitions and you're left with a rock. Keep all your intuitions and you're left with a cave person. Even modus ponens is an intuition. It's just still seems like a good idea after being reflected on. If you try to violate util, you run into paradoxes, contradictions, and other moral incoherence. When you read enough scope and sensitivity, people will pay the same amount to save 50,000 lives as 5,000 lives. You can think it was some incredibly deep moral truth. When you've reflected on enough intuitions and corrected enough absurdities, you start to see that it's more important that many lives be saved. And the optimal path to that destination is governed by math, and that's why I'm a utilitarian. Thus, the standard is maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Prefer additionally, 1. Consequentialism is the only moral system that can solve for rights conflicts, as Leslie Mohammed shows. Util provides a way out of difficulties, arising from the conflict of moral principles. The contention that util permits people to override rights in cases of conflict of principles or in those cases where some recognize utility requires that a right can be disregarded is then not an eternal objection to utilitarianism. Util has its force, and the coherence and simplicity in explaining morality. 2. Deontology always collapses into consequentialism. They say we can never violate a constraint, but that justification that is so morality does not become contradictory. But morality being contradictory only matters of the results of morality being contradictory. If we don't show what to do when things are contradictory, then we allow for ourselves to never be framed or constrained by moral norms. Prefer ends impacts, as this is what both of our norms of morality are for. So let's go on to contention 1. Eminent domain ensures the right to housing. Subpoint A, eminent domain is key to affordable housing, empirically shown, Anderson 06. Eminent domain has been used to help affordable housing developers get land. Development would bring thousands of new jobs and affordable apartments. Eminent domain helps programs claim and clean up vacant properties. Eminent domain cut through legal questions left over by uncertain ownerships. Those homes were empty for years. Falling into ruin, abandoned property drives property values down. And there are countless properties across the country which remain vacant while the communities around them are in need. Eminent domain is a mechanism to reclaim such properties in a way that can benefit local inhabitants. 2 impacts. 1. The conversion of abandoned units into affordable housing accommodates low-income families who would otherwise be left to struggle and fill up low-resource homeless shelters. 2. Properties which have fallen into disrepair deny crucial tax benefits and bring down neighborhood value, discouraging businesses from settling into those areas and creating jobs. Ensuring that individuals have access to housing is fundamental and ensures their welfare. Similarly, thriving economies provide economic stability, affording resilience to residents. Subpoint B. Landowners resist selling their property in order to maintain local monopolies. Eminent domain is necessary to obtaining that land. That's Maselli and Sermons 06. Landowners whose property is essential to some development project block completion in an effort to extract monopoly rents. Sprawl is an inefficient outward expansion of land development. The holdout problem is one cause of sprawl because it biases redevelopment away from the city center where ownership is dispersed and towards the fringe where it's concentrated. Sprawl is socially undesirable. It is appropriate to counteract it. And holdout condemn initiatives like low-income housing from being introduced into a community. A single property owner can prevent beneficial developments. Eminent domain is uniquely key to bypassing these holdouts and getting projects started. This means the neg is uniquely key to solving, as an afrold must withstand holdouts which slow or stop such processes altogether. Contention 2. Eminent domain is economically beneficial. Subpoint A. Eminent domain boosts local economies. That's Chen and U12. Using uniquely assembled data set on takings and decisions and identification strategy exploiting random variation, our study estimates the effect on local economic outcomes, rulings in favors of takings, increased economic growth by 0.7% in a year. Subpoint B, jobs and new businesses and increased tax revenues all result from eminent domain projects. That's Cooksey 14. Eminent domain can provide an entire community with jobs and tax revenues in Village West. Eminent domain was needed to acquire the property of just 2 landowners. As a result of the acquisition, retail and entertainment businesses now occupy the land. Village West bought in 9 million visitors. Now let's go into the AF's case. Off the framework. First, we both concede that morality itself should be the value of the round. However, a lot of her framework itself shows that our framework will function as the highest layer. There are 3 arguments to this. The first argument is off the Gowder evidence. Her framework itself would collapse towards the negative because the U.S. itself, we've proven that the U.S. has an obligation to provide stable compensation and living for people through things like affordable housing. Otherwise, that allows for the rule of law to be subjected to allowing for people to continually suffer within poor housing. If the U.S. needs to provide housing to people, then they should have the obligation of doing that under her own framing of rule of law. But also B is also, too, is that you can impact her conceptualization of the rule of law. We see that sometimes, as per her own Cohen evidence and Allen and Chenoweth evidence, it shows that sometimes coercion itself is a good thing. Sometimes the United States needs to take action in order to incentivize people to give up their homes so that we can use it for good purposes. Otherwise, you allow for people to live in poor housing and poor property, and we need those housings in order to allow for people to live in better property. Also, 3 is that there's no bright line to what constitutes what the rule of law is. So when it becomes about weighing between different rules, you don't know how to weigh between whether or not people need affordable housing or whether or not people should allow for things like property values, which means that this all collapses into consequentialism because it shows the best weighing claims for the affirmative. So there's a couple of solemnity indicts. First is that eminent domain is a necessity for sustainable city planning despite any objections. That's Cooley 09. There are ethical reasons justifying a duty for the West, especially the U.S. to adopt sustainable city planning. The union of the duty and legal framework forms a strong case for the American government to use eminent domain to override property rights. The U.S. uses far greater resources than is necessary for maintaining high-quality lives. Given that other countries are growing in economic and political power, the U.S. remains dependent on their goods, and governments are obligated to guarantee the opportunity for flourishing lives for their citizens and their community. Now you can group some of her contentions together. First, her first and fourth contention make the same claims. It's about weighing undercompensation versus things like subjective value. We say that people can arbitrarily inflate the prices of their house, i.e. the example that was given in Cross-X from 100,000 to 200,000 to prevent the U.S. from doing good things towards the people's communities. We say that this is net bad because it stops developers from trying to build up different types of environments. This also checks against the second contention because it shows why the U.S. has a necessity to actually prevent people from living in toxic environments and actually help them live, which means that the negative will always outweigh a lot of the affirmative claims and shows why we're a prerequisite to it in the first place. Cross-X?
Yeah, you good?
Yeah.
You said group the first and fourth contention. What was the argument you made here?
Yeah, so it's weighing subjective value versus undercompensation. So we're saying that we should weigh the ways in which subjective value itself can be arbitrarily inflated and causes people to...
Sure. Let's go to the NC.
Sure.
Let's turn on this card. You say that revisionary intuitionism is true. Where in the card does this prove that?
So the NC card, the Udowatsky evidence, talks about how when we're talking about things like torture, there are some objective things that we can talk about how torture itself is good or bad, but sometimes we have to delete some of our intuitions or look at our intuitions in order to prove...
Okay, yeah, sure. I guess my question is more, why does that necessarily prove that util is true? Like, it seems that this card talks about moral level reasoning possibly being abstract, and then util.
No, so the
Where
card
does
talks.
the internal
Yeah, so no, the
linkage
card talks specifically about how some people will recognize that saving 50,000 lives is just as valuable as saving 5,000 lives. However, we can look at that there being certain moral violations that we should never go against, but we should always weigh the people as a priority.
Wait, so you agree that there are certain moral violations that we should never make,
Yes,
correct?
no. So the card recognizes
Okay.
that there are certain
No, no, no.
moral inherent truths, but sometimes we have to weigh
there are certain
50,000
moral
versus
inherent truths,
5,000.
correct? There are certain moral inherent truths, correct?
Yes, I don't
Okay,
think any of
what's
our
an
frameworks
example
disagree
of
with that.
What's an example
I think
of
that the government offering sustainable housing towards its population is an example of that, and I think the
Why?
affirmative violates that.
Wait, why?
Because people objectively live in toxic environments. The government should
Wait, that
offer
seems to be
affordable
circular.
housing.
You say that governments should offer affordable housing because they live in toxic environments. I'm asking where you
That's
prove
not
that that is
circular.
something
That comes
that
to
the
a
government has
conclusion,
to
which
do.
is the impact. If people
Like,
live
why
in
does your
toxic
framework prove
environments,
that this is
then we
something the
should offer
government
it.
has to do?
Say that again?
Why does your framework prove that this is something the government has to do?
Well, the framework proves that there is an obligation of the government to provide and actually help the people.
Where?
I think, so the framework shows that we have a preference for things like consequentialism. If we don't
Okay.
focus on things like consequences,
Wait, you also said
then
that
we
there are
allow
more
people to just
okay,
be harmed.
yeah, sorry. You also said that there are more inherent moral truths. How do we know what those truths are?
Yeah, so in the context of the 1NC and the 1AC, your 1AC says that it's about a prescription of law, the rule of law. I say that yes, we can talk about things like the rule of law, but I think that the rule of law needs to be framed in the context of things like consequences
Okay,
or body
cool.
count. So I don't disagree with some of the
Sure.
claims that your AC has made, but I just disagree with the fundamental conclusion of it.
Yeah, sure. Let's go to the first contention subpoint A. You see that empirically housing has been improved as a result of eminent domain. The first line of your card just says that eminent domain has been used to help affordable housing developers get land. Where do you prove that that land has been used to actually improve housing?
Yeah, so that's the problem with only reading the first line. The second line says that development would bring thousands of new jobs. and
Development
affordably-
would bring thousands of new jobs, correct? Where do you prove that it actually has done that?
Yeah, so it gives the example about how 4,500 planned apartment buildings were created, and that helped carry 900 residents that were low income and brought them into that housing, which means that it gave affordable housing to those people who did not have it.
Alrighty, let's start with the negative case. What was the value criterion? Alright, which is basically just utilitarianism. And there were two warrants that were provided for this. The first one was a piece of evidence that was debated about the cross-examination for some period of time. Who was the author and what was the argument that it was making? Someone.
Budovsky and the visionary evolutionism is true.
Okay, and then the second main warrant for why it was good is because of this other piece of evidence, and underneath the criterion itself, what's the author, what's the argument?
I guess the author, but is it that they aren't classed as consequentialism apparently?
Yeah, and one of the reasons for that is
Like the circular logic of trying to determine inherent truths, or?
I was more interested in the first argument, which is like it solves rights conflicts. Mole land or whatever, I don't know. Sure, that piece of evidence. Okay, let's get to the interesting stuff. The first contention is about what? Housing. How does eminent domain help with housing? Can someone tell me that?
Housing developers can get land, like affordable housing developers can get land through eminent domain as like, the landowners, she gave the example of like, we kind of hold on to it to, maintain the properties. So I guess it's also like applicable to, the government getting the land.
Okay, who thinks this is a good argument? Raise your hands, everyone. Or if you don't raise your hands, but I'd assume you would think this is like a decent argument. What makes it a good argument in your mind? Someone want to tell me? Who have I not called on for?
I feel like if it might be some land that's just like not being used, like it's always better to use it for something
Sure, that seems reasonable to me. Let's do contention 2. It's economically beneficial. There's 2 subpoints. What was the first one? The author and its argument. Who have I not called?
Is that Chen Yi?
Chen and Yang, yes.
It's saying that it increases job growth, right?
Not exactly the argument here. That's probably more related to the second subpoint. What about the first one?
Like
Yeah, and there was a number that was provided. Can anyone tell me what that number was?
0.7.
Yeah, 0.7% growth. The second subpoint is indeed about jobs. Can you tell me more about that?
Alright, yes, the second, it was talking about how it creates job growth as when you use certain like broken down houses to make like malls or like bigger corporate things to employ a lot of people.
And there's also an example providing this piece of evidence. Can anyone tell me a little bit more about this example?
Was it about Village West?
Yes.
And the 9 million, like.
Yeah, correct. Visitors. All right. So now let's talk about the negatives, answers to the affirmative case. Let's just get to the contention so we can get back to the debating and you stop listening to me talking. There was one piece of evidence that was read as an answer to the affirmative contentions. Can anyone tell me what it was and what it said? Cooley and 9, yes. And what did it say? Okay, and can anyone explain why this might be the case? Or are you all confused about why this might be the case? I see no reactions that are confused. Oh, yes.
So she was pretty much talking about how like at some points like we might be like forcing this on the people, but overall the government's idea of it is to like oversight and like to better the citizens' life. So at the moment you might be like taking the life of the people, but in general in like the long term you're bettering the citizens' lives.
Okay, sure. There are two other main arguments that the negative made as an answer to the affirmative case. Can someone tell me one of them?
Overinflate the value of their house.
Sure. And what was the main argument?
Like, so it's to save people from like toxic environment.
Yes, to stop, there's some sort of government obligation to stop people from living in toxic conditions. Okay, hopefully this is enough to get on with 1AR. You ready? Speak louder this time, thank you.
I'll make you sound. Okay. Orders F and C. Huh? F and C. Okay. Is everyone good? Okay. Also, I apologize preemptively if my voice starts dying. Okay. Extend the Allo and Chenoweth 09 card. The rule of law is key to democracy, which controls the internal to your framework. Democracies are necessary for creating deliberation for utilitarian solutions to problems. It's also key to things like good governance, which also means that our framework outweighs under yours because it controls the interlink in things like promoting good government and happiness for its citizens. On your 8 point, onto the line by line of your arguments in response to the framework, on your 8 points that you don't prove that they necessarily have to do these things that are associated with the rule of law. For example, things like housing. You're not proving this, which means that you should be granted this argument. B point, this doesn't justify using eminent domain. It justifies using another policy that does not violate the rule of law to resolve things like housing. On your B point, you say impact turn the coercion can be good. A point assumes utilitarianism. B point, coercion is necessarily a bad thing. For example, getting pleasure from watching someone being tortured, we know that is necessarily a bad thing, which means that we appeal to some higher order rule that isn't just utilitarianism, i.e. weighing between the pleasure and the pain. Onto your C point, you say that there's no bright line. First is the Waldron 16 card is really clear. The rule of law pertains to democratic principles, i.e. things like checks and balances and fairness, contractual governmental relationships. Also, the rule of law is different than the A rule of law. Our framework deals with the questions of ideal rule of law, like i.e. the ideal rather than the individual different forms of law, which means that you misunderstood the framework. Now, onto the line by line. So I'm going to send the first and third contentions under compensation as well as exploitation. The eminent domain always undercompensates since things that perceived benefits from eminent domain projects are factored into account when giving compensation, but there's no way to enforce that certain projects are actually a hand. But there are several impacts to this argument. 8 points that minority communities will always be excluded, which is a massive impact under both our frameworks, since fairness and equal protection is an integral part of the rule of law and also causes massive unhappiness, which outweighs under cyclicality. B points that undercompensation destroys reciprocity and the contractual relationship between governments, which also outweighs, since there's no relationships between the relationships between governments and citizens permeate all aspects of society and continue, but your impacts like things like housing and economy are specific to particular circumstances and easily subject to change. Also, now I'll respond to your case turn. First overview, this is not a case turn. The app is not consequentialist. We only hear things about procedures that are consistent with the rule of law, so none of these terms actually apply. But onto the Coley evidence one, this card is cut out, the warrant is just cut out of this card. It just asserts that there's an ethical to justify duty for the West, but no reason as to why we need to do so. Second, this doesn't pertain to the rule of law, which only deals with questions ideals with checks and balances or procedures within the state itself. 3, that this evidence just asserts that there's a strong case to be made, but does not make the case itself. Don't evaluate this piece of evidence because there's no warrant in it. Now, onto the NC. First thing, Udosky evidence, the warrant in this card is cut out. The warrant in this card is cut out. Second is that utilitarianism fails. 8 points like aggregation is impossible. There's no way to waive things like 5 headaches versus 5 migraines, which means that things like aggregation are too simplistic. B points that butterfly effect means that utilitarianism is indeterminate and irresolvable. If I stop my foot, via a series of events, it could cause an earthquake in China, but that doesn't mean I should be held responsible for it. Now, onto the Mullen card one. Our frame overview to the additional reasons for our framework is not deontology. It does not deal with questions of rights. It's just a procedures about how we control things. Right? Second is that all your arguments assume universality, which my framework is. And now, overview to the contention level one. The first overview to the contention level, my framework doesn't disagree that housing and the economy are necessarily a good thing. It just constrains the procedure by which we do so. So we can use other methods by virtue to solve them. Now, onto your first contention 8. That this evidence proves my argument. All the projects she talks about is a pure speculation. You say that they're empirics, but read the first line. The card, all the evidence in the card just talks about speculation and what could happen as a result of a project that has not actually happened. This type of stuff only happens in theory, but not proven as actually, which proves our exploitation and undercompensation arguments. Now, onto your second, you say holdout one. This evidence does not say eminent domain is key. It just said it can potentially help housing. Don't vote on it. Second, this is justifies another policy that prevents local monopolies, not just seizing property from individuals. Now, into the second contention 8 point. This card does not say words about eminent domain. It is possible to determine what is saying that evidence could be in the context of takings in general, which I don't disagree with. It is specifically about the context of economic development takings are uniquely bad and problematic. Now, you're on the Cooksey evidence one. This is one isolated instance. It does not prove a general trend. Don't vote on this argument. Second, this doesn't help the right people since it forces the people that need the most help out of those communities via exploitation, because minorities will no longer have access to things like housing or things like public schools in itself. So this argument does not ultimately help the impoverished at all.
Alright, there's a lot of stuff in there, but I'd like some just general thoughts about the 1AR before we jump into some of the more specific things that it said. So, broad question, how do you all feel about this 1AR? What are your all's initial impressions or intuitions about that? So my first word is fast. I heard that one whispered. What else was in there?
She didn't drop anything.
Everything was covered. That's another thing. What else?
There's like a clear order to it, so she went down and going to the end seats.
Yeah, and that's good because...
That's good because it's easy for us to follow.
Yeah, if it were slower, it'd be easy for us to follow. Okay, what else?
There was a lot of really good word economy going down as well.
Sure, word economy was really strong. One or two more other things I'm interested in.
She tried to point out misconceptions of her framework that she intended.
Okay, good. There's a lot of framework debate and clarification of it. Finally.
She flowed through the element 9, potential 1, potential 3.
And why did she only do that?
She only did that because
So like there are other contentions. Why were those not accepted?
they were attacked by like saying that compensation was a subjective value.
Sure, but there's another more simplistic reason, which is that it did what in the 1AR? It saved time, made it easier, right? Because there were responses against it. Okay, so those are some good general thoughts about this 1AR. I'm interested in what you all think were the best 1AR arguments now. So can anyone list what you think out of the 1AR was the best 1AR argument that was made? Either an extension that was made, or a response to the negative case, or a response to the framework or the value criterion. What was the best argument?
I think the framework debate, she extends the democracy card and talks about how rule of law is key to democracy. So she says that she's proposing internally to citizenship or something like that, and improving citizen lives.
So this is one of the best 1AR arguments because
which basically gives her control of the framework.
Sure, because they are trying to access something that the negative has said, which is utilitarianism. Because we increase that good governance, which is key to making people happy in the long run. All right, that is a good argument. What else?
The extension of contention 3 just because it gives clear offense under both frameworks. That's just totally understandable.
Sure, and what is that offense underneath the negatives value criterion?
So underneath the negative value criterion, it's just that a certain group of people is found by eminent domain for economic development takings.
And that does what? It just use language in the negatives criteria.
Increases power.
Yeah, okay, cool. That's another good argument. Let's look for two more things that the 1AR did well in terms of the arguments, yeah?
So what I liked is how she differentiated the rule of law versus our rule of law, and that kind of extended one of the cards in, I think it was the last card in the 1AR, and that kind of, I think that really did a lot of what the 1AR touched on about how the rule of law is inconsistent with detail.
Okay, sure. there were some clarifications of what the rule of law is to help deal with some of the misconceptions and responses the negative made. One more argument.
I like the argument on the framework, the negative framework that says like our framework is not deontology, but it like agrees that there are universal truths.
Okay.
And I think that was important. One of
All right, I agree. So I'm going to toss in a few other 1AR arguments, and I'd like your all's thoughts and opinions of them. How could they change? How could they be better? Were they good in the first place? There's this theme that runs through the 1AR, that the affirmative does not disagree with any of the outcomes that the negative has pointed out being good, such as increased housing, such as an improved economy, but rather that the affirmative cares about procedures to get to that. How do we achieve housing? How do we improve the economy? This argument popped up in at least 2 separate locations. What do you all think about this argument? Why was it made several times? Do you think it's strong? Do you think it could have been made better?
So either one.
I like that a lot because it generally provides ways for them to use their own framework that you can achieve these outcomes while not violating the rule of law, which is her own framework, which allows a lot of her own intentions to actually shine and.
Sure, I agree. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a good argument because there's no real way to turn a housing impact. No one's gonna argue that affordable housing is bad for the society. So the only way to really attack that argument about giving housing is through the solvency. And if you can prove that it won't happen, that's a way to defeat that argument because you can't interact with the impacts. You have to actually show that it won't happen through eminent domain or it'll happen through your case better.
Okay. Sure. One more thought about this argument.
I like the argument. I think one way it could have been stronger is actually giving an alternative.
Sure. How do people feel about that suggestion? So what would, in your mind, be a good alternative to suggest to deal with one of the problems the negative is either it's housing problem or it's the economy problem? Like what could the 1AR have said?
Yeah, like outside of like doing people's housing events, development, and another.
Housing development projects are also a way to solve it. What about like the economy issue? There's so many ways to do the economy. I just need one.
I think she said it was speculation.
Well, okay, we'll actually jump to that argument next because that's what I was really interested in. But I'm really referencing this argument here, which is like there are other ways to improve the economy that do not violate the rule of law. So could someone like give me an example of what one of those things might be?
Maybe using the money saved by not having like eminent domain. Maybe you could either like afford to lower taxes, or you could like, I mean honestly, there's a lot of things you could do with the leftover money that would then stimulate the economy.
Sure, that is definitely a potential argument the affirmative could make. So now let's jump onto this thing that you mentioned, which is that the affirmative made a lot of presses into the quality of the negative's evidence, specifically asking about where are the examples, where has this occurred? Was this good affirmative debating, or do you think this was a waste of the affirmative time?
It was good because like if you were to prove with the negative evidence and getting good quality evidence, and she has better evidence, then the judge can go off of that because it's obviously better than.
Okay, sure. And so what were some of the issues that the affirmative pointed out with the negative evidence?
It was all speculation. There was no, like it didn't actually happen. They were saying this could happen or it would happen, but there was no empirical fact other than that one instance, which the affirmative said it happened once, we don't know if it happened.
Okay, my last question is, at the end of this 1AR, where do you think the affirmative has put most of their best arguments? What do you think the 2AR is going to have to say as a result of giving this 1AR? Where are their best arguments located, and what are they sort of stuck to going for in the 2AR? So when the 2AR happens, what do you think it's going to sound like as a result of this 1AR? Yeah.
So I think it's going to argue first, emphasize her framework about the rule of law and emphasize her idea of it, and then move on with that and argue against utilitarianism, and then argue like by using eminent domain, like you're actually discriminating against these people. Like she attacked I think it was the sleep forcing evidence by talking about how like by you're forcing the most people with the people with like the most need out of these places when you're actually using eminent domain and forcing it, and that like goes against the rule of law, and I think like she's gonna emphasize that.
Okay.
Since she flowed through really well with her Allen and Shakespeare card, I think she needs to keep extending all those arguments into her 2AR, and she attacked the first
so knowing this in mind, let's see what the 2NR does to deal with this 1AR.
Are we all good? So the order is going to be the negative case with an overview at the top. It's like just the voting issues, and then on to the affirmative case. Okay, are we all good? So the order is the NC with an overview at the top, and then the AC. Here. This debate round breaks down simply. It becomes about the affirmative defending that eminent domain in its totality must be banned. If the negative proves that any independent reason as to why eminent domain itself should still exist, then you should negate automatically. So there's 3 voting issues. The first is that the framework itself becomes very arbitrary. The affirmative itself is all about the rule of law, but that does not preclude things like consequentialism. We say that consequentialism itself should frame how the rule of law is made applicable within things like the status quo, which means that even if the affirmative says it's about things like the rule of law, it's about how you get to the ends. We've already agreed that yes, governmental policy itself is a good thing, but it's about how you get there and how you justify those impacts. Also, too, the second voting issue is that a lot of the affirmative's arguments were very defensive. If you heard a lack of offense and all she did was question pieces of evidence, then there's no reason as to why you should vote for her at the end of the day, which means we'll get to that on the line by line. The third is that she has not done a good analysis about how eminent domain is key to bolstering the economy, building things like affordable housing, building things like mall strips, building different types of property values itself can boost an economy and allow for communities themselves to be thriving. So let's go on to the NC proper. First, I'll do the framing here. First, that you can extend the Mohammed evidence. Mohammed evidence would say that consequentialism itself is a justified system. Consequentialism itself would frame the rule of law because it means that even if the government has to do something or has to do something to justify its purposes, it should be framed in the context of its consequences. So if we prove any independent reason as to how the 1AC itself causes harm towards the people or does not justify the people being does not justify the people being helped at all, then we've done our job in terms of the framework, which means that all we have to do is link offense as to why these consequences and why the 1AC violates both of these things. Now, let's go into some of the contention level offense. There's only 2 arguments coming off the first contention. She talks about how the card only talks about things like empirics. Well, this is the problem with debaters. They only read one piece of the line. Read the evidence. The Anderson 06 evidence gives you very concrete examples about how this is not just theory. This occurred within places like Philadelphia, about how eminent domain itself built affordable housing for those people and gave low-income residents a place to stay at, which means that eminent domain itself can become a necessity to provide people with the types of lands, the types of properties that they can need to have their communities thriving. Also, too, is that her next argument says that eminent domain itself is is a way of manipulating the people. One is that, no, this is empirically disproven. Philadelphia itself disproves her claim. It talks about how low-income residents can get help. But also, too, is that all we have to do is prove that eminent domain itself can provide people with the option of having a different types of housing or having different types of lands in order to help them. This allows for us to show that we fix things like discrepant houses and discrepant homes that people live in. Oftentimes, people live in low-income housing or housing that's literally falling apart, which means that in order to allow for people to get better access to better homes, then we need eminent domain sometimes to pay it off, because otherwise some people will subjectively inflate the prices of their houses to be $200,000, whereas the government could buy it off for $100,000 and provide the city with different types of affordable sustaining plans and give them more types of prosperous values. Also, let's go into the second contention. She did a poor job at handling the second contention. It shows that how we have to fight things like displacement with the economic stability. The second contention with the Chen and Yet evidence goes cold conceded. It says that it bolsters the economy through things like eminent domain. When we build things like mall strips through buying out people's properties, that allows for us to build up different types of jobs, different types of, it helps us boost the city's economy. This is necessarily good because it gives people jobs. If people are lacking in jobs, now the government has provided to them by building up a mall. The affirmative itself has conceded this, which outweighs a lot of the claims because it means that we've ultimately helped the population. It also disproves a lot of the rule of law claims because it shows that the biggest rule of law for the United States should be helping the people get a job at the end of the day. That's better than the 1AC's contentions and also shows why the 1AC itself is just a fundamentally flawed idea. Now, the only argument that she has against this is that this is only about one incident. But no, we think that this theory itself is applicable to both places like Philadelphia and Kansas, but also just the entirety of the world. If the 1AC itself is just a plan itself, if the 1AC itself is about helping people, we think that the better way of helping people is through things like eminent domain to give people access to different reasonable jobs. So that means that you should strongly negate, especially on a lot of the contention level offense. But let's go into the case. Biggest problem with the case is that, yes, it doesn't matter what the framework is, she's still losing a lot of the arguments that comes off on the substance. Even if she wins that the rule of law comes first, she hasn't defended why this is a deontological framework, which means that, yes, you can talk about things like intent, but you also have to defend your consequences of your action. If we prove any independent reason as to why the 1AC is just a fundamentally flawed idea, then you should not trust it at all. She extends the first and third contention. However, I think the Cooley evidence takes this out spectacularly. It talks about how eminent domain itself is key to sustainable city planning. So she says it's about how she says that some people will always be excluded, that we won't ever bolster the economy. However, the Cooley evidence takes this into account. It says that through things like sustainable city planning, we can allow for communities themselves to thrive by building different types of strips, building different types of landing property in order to give them access to different types of development. But also, too, is that it uniquely disproves a lot of the AF's claims, because even if the AF says that it causes economic development to decrease, it actually increases different types of property values and it increases different types of lands, because it makes the city seem like a more populous area by increasing things like tax revenue. When you have different types of strips and you have different types of property, it increases the value of that community and allows for it to be functionally thriving, which means the round breaks down simply. The app has not done anything at all to help the people, and the negative is the only one that's thinking about the population at hand and actually providing things like community planning.
All right, same as last time, let's just start with some general thoughts about this negative speech. What are your gut reactions, intuitions?
I think the argument by like saying that like these are broken down houses and they're like taking them and like selling them and like giving them money for it is like not a good argument, because of the fact that whenever you make that argument, like let's just say you buy a house for like $50,000 that's like broken down, all the windows are broken, right? That family can't go and buy a sustainable house, another sustainable house for another $50,000, right? So you're actually lowering their quality of life. They already have a place to live, but they might not be able to find another place to live with that kind of money.
It's a strange gut reaction to the whole of the siege, but okay, that is indeed an interesting issue that could be raised with the negative arguments, but I'm more interested in big picture. Well, we might be able to delve into the details later.
I found the overview at the very beginning to be extremely effective in that it gave a really pretty balanced story and sort of like set the tone for the rest of the speech. Like, it didn't necessarily like disregard the entirety of the framework, but it showed why it should come second as opposed to like the intentional offense.
Okay, sure. There was a really strong overview at the top of the negative speech. Can someone tell me some of the good things about this overview? So you mentioned that it helped write a good ballot story. What are some other things that it really helped do?
She brought the rule of law into the realm of consequences, and she said that the rule of law should be framed by consequences.
Okay, this was an interesting argument, and it was also, I believe, in the overview. My flow sort of got messed up. I haven't floating paper in a while. But what is this argument? What does it say?
It's basically saying that in order to analyze like how the rule of law should be implemented, you have to look at the end result, which is the consequential system.
Okay, sure. So what are some other things about this overview that you thought were nice and helped the debate? Yes. You. Sarah. Yes.
Okay. I thought it was like very organized. Like I knew exactly where she was going with the speech. Like of course she went there because she like outlined it. And I thought that was
Okay, and so what clarifying issues, or what issues did this really clarify at the top? So like, now that you've heard this overview, how would you sum up this debate? Like, how did this overview clear up this debate for you?
Well, she emphasized how her main point is like the economy and how she's boosting the economy. She emphasized that in her overview and emphasized how it like fits under her framework and the idea of framework. So like it fits under the consequentialist idea.
Okay, sure. Any other thoughts?
It clarified the offense-defense distinction because the neg was saying that the majority of the app's arguments were primarily defensive. They were saying why certain pieces of evidence or certain arguments weren't true, whereas the negative was focusing primarily on offense and extending arguments. So I think clarifying that one side focused more on offense while the other just showed by the other side might have been wrong, definitely helped just flow around.
Okay, sure. I have a question. Between the housing and the economy point that was extended in the second negative rebuttal, which one do you think was stronger and why?
I did think that both were equally strong, but if you look at it in the big picture, like housing was even stronger because everybody needs a place to stay and not everybody has the same level of income, and that's why affordable housing is extremely important and it is an obligation for the government to be able to provide that.
Okay, so which one of these arguments mattered more under the affirmative framework of rule of law? The housing argument or the economy argument? Which one do you think rule of law cares more about?
I think rule of law, housing falls more under the app, and then the economy falls more than over the neg, because the neg obviously has more of a utilitarian view, and she's trying to like help the whole economy. As for like the app is trying to like make a moral decision about like what they should be doing and how like if it's right to like take housing from people, and to say the housing idea I guess is more important under the app.
Okay, someone else had their hand up over here, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's actually the economy argument, because I think there was an argument that was made that says, it's like on the NC on contention one, it says that like eminent domain means that there are like different types of land, or that there's like better land, which means that people have access to like better homes and stuff like that, which means that like raising the economy like is probably the internal.
Okay, one more hand back there.
I think that with the negative, especially, housing is very important because if you're talking about like eminent domain, which is basically like taking away people's houses, you need to have like a net benefit for like giving more people houses in general. So I think like the affirmative has to some extent shut that down by showing like either that the housing issue is smaller than the economic issue, or that the affirmative can also put housing. I agree with that.
Okay, just a few last questions. First of all, what other parts of the speech would you consider good? So we've talked about the overview, we've talked about how these arguments function underneath the affirmative framework and how the negative made a concerted effort to say the contention level debating comes first. What else is really good about the speech? It can be presentation or content, something, anything.
I like the argument that she tags like the problems with AC, and that she just says that it's problematic as well as how rule of law doesn't really like link to deontology, and yeah.
Okay, one or two more?
Like the combination of like the conceded like C2B and then like the city plan argument gave like a really good position for the neg, because like the only like argument that the app had on the economic benefits thing is that like it's basically an isolated incident and that like the minorities have an access. She argued the minorities argument with the city plan, and then as a result they just want to concede that basically there's economic benefits within the domain, which is why you should keep it, which like she basically says in the overview she can prove one reason why you should keep it in the domain, then you go in the neg.
Oh, I forgot about this argument. This is a really interesting one. How do you feel about the app has to defend a total ban? Any reason why eminent domain is potentially good? It's a reason to vote negative. Good argument, bad argument?
I think it's a really good argument because it puts the neg at like this disadvantage. Because the app has to prove like unequivocally that like all instances of eminent domain ever have like been all over the world, where the negative only needs to give like one good instance, and then like that way she has a lot less to do than the affirmative, and it's just
Okay, yeah.
My thought about it is that it doesn't really fit under the consequentialism framework well, because if you're trying to only prove one instance, it's not like fully weighing benefits versus disadvantages. It's only like looking at one benefit instead of weighing everything on net.
The idea that if the neg proves that it's good in one way seems more like a deontological kind of thing, whereas the neg was arguing utilitarianism for the whole ground. So under util, if there are more benefits than detriments, then you should keep it. Whereas in this argument, it was if there's a single benefit to eminent domain, you should keep it. So I don't think it fits with the util framework.
Okay, so it's same idea.
I agree with what he just said, but I also believe that she can probably just bring up and put an unfair burden upon her. It's a little ridiculous to think that you only have to prove one single instance, especially since she is using a util framework. So I think it's not a very strong argument, though it is if she misses it for some reason, even though it's so obviously put there, it'll be really simple for her to lose.
Okay. There are definitely a lot of more things I want to ask about, but I think we'll just let the 2AR happen so we can get out of here.
Okay. So, the order is that it's going to start with addressing her overview about me having to prove every instance, and then it's just going to go mainly on the affirmative. It'll mostly be kind of like, like her stuff that talks of what? What?
Oh, I was just going to tell you to speak up. I couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. So the first part's going to address her overview, the part that talks about how I have to prove that every instance of eminent domain is bad, and then it's going to mainly be on the affirmative, and then it'll be kind of like overview-y, way, whatever. Is everyone good? Okay. First, in response to her overview, this overview is obviously ridiculous. 8 doesn't fit with the utilitarianism framework since we shall weigh costs and benefits as opposed to individual things that might be just or unjust. B that this is unfair and unjustified. It's impossible for you to prove that something is always bad in every single instance, but you only having to prove one. We tell you should reject this burden on face. Now, onto the line by line, you've conceded several framework arguments. First, you can see that our framework is a procedural constraint on yours. Procedural constraint on yours. We agree. Our framework is not deontology. It doesn't deal with identifying principles. It just deals with identifying principles consisting of the rule of law. You've also conceded explicit reasons why utilitarianism logically fails. This comes prior to all of your arguments because it proves that your form of theory is impossible. For example, aggregation being impossible is something that was conceded in this 2R, which means that you cannot use utilitarianism even if it sounds like a good idea. Now, here's the problem with this debate. 8 points that the negative concedes explicit reasons why your framework fails, and B point is that negative conceded that my framework is already a procedural question on there. C point is that you concede that the minority is weighing down on the contention, and that is offense under your framework. All we have to do in this instance is when an argument wins the round. If you are at any point confused about how the framework debate resolves, vote affirmative since we are the only ones actually winning offense under both sides, and the only possible offense you have under the rule of law framework is this argument that jobs should be right, but you can see the overview framing argument, which is that this does not prove that eminent domain is necessarily a good thing, nor that it is key. You have not proven that you use uniquely something is good, but instead that includes that we need an alternative policy to resolve things like jobs, and our framework would agree that this is a good thing. We just need to only have policies that do not conflict with the rule of law. Now we're getting, and now on to the impact of the minorities contender. You've already conceded cyclicality framing argument, so several framing issues here. 8 points that all the impacts might be true, but you're wholly inconclusive since the people who need the most help are already kicked out. This is a conceded weighing argument out of the 2R, which outweighs on cyclicality, and it also is a question of the NC solvency because the NC cannot solve for things like minorities, which is going to outweigh eminent domain exploits core communities are politically the framing issue here is that you also concede that kicking minorities causes massive suffering, which is independently outweighs under your framework because even if people live in poor housing, our evidence proves that disrupting communities causes massive psychological and physical violence against people. It causes things such as riots. C point that you've also conceded disrupting contractual relationships between government and citizens, which also outweighs on magnitude since things like housing and economy are subject to change, but other things such as relationship with governments permeate to all aspects of society. You've already conceded these magnitude and weight arguments. I can see the content of your contention, but you've already conceded the overall framing issue here, which means that this debate is super duper clear. In conclusion, this round is really clear. 8 points that I have offense under the framework. She does not have offense under mine. If you think that the framework debate is confusing, the only thing you're 100% certain is being won in this round is this minorities framing. B point is that you concede that there are alternatives that can resolve every single one of your impacts. Things like the economy or housing are things that can be resolved with alternative policy. That is what your arguments concluded, not things like eminent domain, which you've not proven is uniquely good, and none of your evidence proves that. Even if you think all my arguments on the NC were defensive, yeah, they were defensive, but they also prove that eminent domain is not uniquely necessary for any of your impacts, which means that alternatives can resolve it. Our framework would agree with that. You can't violate the rule of law.